Good morning, and thank you, Pat, for such a nice introduction, and thank you, Dr. Vicki Sims, for this incredible program and inviting me to it. It's a real honor, and I have to thank all of you for being here. I know many of you had to fight the 405 or the Sepulveda Pass, and I really am grateful for all of you for being here today. I'm here to speak on one of my most favorite subjects, building a culture of health. And we're going to focus on building a culture of health one routine at a time. And there are three objectives that I'd like to cover today. One is to identify 3 strategies to promote healthful eating among children and families. The second is to identify at least 3 evidence-based interventions to prevent obesity among preschool children. And the third is to describe the parent training intervention and identify at least 2 social learning strategies used in the parent training sessions to help build routines. Now, many of us are fully aware of the overweight problem, and I'm just going to give some background to set the context for us. We still are seeing an increase in childhood overweight and obesity, unfortunately. We're also seeing a risk of a child turning into an obese adult if they suffer from obesity in childhood. And also we're seeing a rise in comorbidities, not only in adulthood, but also in childhood. And we're seeing adulthood comorbidities during adolescence even earlier. There has been a significant linear trend for youth and adults since obesity hit the airwaves in the United States in terms of the epidemic. Since 1999 until 2016, we are still seeing an upward tick for children, youth, 2 to 18, and also adults. And unfortunately, what we see, and many of you in this room work with preschool children, I think most of you do, we see this occurring early. 2 to 5-year-olds are suffering from obesity, and there's great disparity among different ethnic and racial groups, with the Hispanic population in the 2 to 5-year-old age group suffering among the most, 16.5% obesity among this most recent report from the CDC. And so why is there this pediatric obesity epidemic? Well, is it larger portion sizes? Poor routines? We heard from Dr. Panda. We also heard from Dr. Medell how we can improve our routines. Is it changing food systems? Is it lack of early detection by people like me, pediatricians? Or is it low rates of exclusive breastfeeding? What would you say? Just throw out. All the above, exactly. And many more, probably. So do you think that children grow out of obesity? This has been a common sort of mantra, at least early on in this epidemic. Who thinks that children grow out of obesity? Raise their hand. Who thinks that we need to do some active interventions? Yes. So children can shift their linear or upward tick, and we'll talk about a study that I worked on for 4 years, collaborated with Vicki Sims on it. And the problem is that most children, though, if you don't do anything about it, will either be 5 times greater risk of becoming an obese adult, 2 times greater risk, 3 times, 6 times. Okay, who thinks it's 5 times greater risk if you're an obese child to become an obese adult? How about 2 times? 3 times? 6 times? Well, you're pretty close. Most people said 6 times, it's 5 times. You are 5 times more likely to become an obese adult. And why are we worried about this? Well, with the rising rates of obesity in adulthood, we're seeing increased risk and development of type 2 diabetes. Now, I'd like everyone in the center row to stand up, please, if you can. Please stand up. This is also a little exercise break for you guys. So everyone in the center, and if you want to stand up in the sides, you can, but this is sort of to bring the point home. 1 out of 3 over 20-year-olds in the United States today are pre-diabetic, and that accounts for about the people that are standing up right now. and those that are sitting down would be the ones without that diagnosis. Now I want everybody except the first 3 rows to sit down now, please. Only 1 out of 10 people who are pre-diabetic know it. So it's not just that we have this epidemic, it's also that there's lack of knowledge and assessment. And go ahead and you can sit down now. This is not only a tsunami waiting to happen in terms of health, but it's also a huge cost to our society. There are $327 billion spent annually, this is from 2017, on medical costs and reduced productivity due to our epidemic around diabetes in adulthood. And that does not even account for some of this pain and suffering that's associated with this comorbidity of obesity. We do know, though, that simple lifestyle change can make a difference if you do have prediabetes. And this study was published in 2002 in the New England Journal of Medicine. And it's basically routines. It's implementing routines of exercise 5 times a week, 10,000 steps a day, you build up to it, modest modifications of your food intake, and then you get a subsequent weight loss. Now with Dr. Panda's work, I think that we should be doing a randomized controlled trial like they did in 2002 and try some other kinds of interventions that could impact people with prediabetes, because this study showed that 58% reduced risk of getting diabetes if you do these kind of simple changes in your life. Routines. So why don't we start with routines early? Because what we're seeing now also with our children is that they are developing these comorbid conditions that we see in adulthood related to obesity, unfortunately. And many of you in this room are aware of this. We see children with diabetes. In my morbid obesity clinic that I take care of patients who've been referred to UCLA, we're seeing children with many complaints around their GI, their they have sleep apnea, asthma, mental health disorders, high blood pressure, musculoskeletal complaints, and poor school performance. On average, the children we see in our multidisciplinary clinic have 5 comorbid conditions, and up to 50% of those comorbid conditions are related to their mental health. Now we're lucky today, we have almost 20, I hope, pediatric residents from UCLA here who are learning not just about how to manage, unfortunately, these adult diseases that we were never trained in my time when I was trained as a pediatrician, but they're here also to learn the emerging science that Vicki Sims has pulled together here around sleep, around circadian rhythms. This is a science that we can use in the future to really prevent this pediatric obesity epidemic and also manage what might, as we learned, could be reversed if we institute some of these circadian rhythm-like behaviors. So, we do know at this point, though, that there's some tools that we've been using for a while, like the MyPlate, which has been very useful, at least in educating parents on the proportions of what children should eat. And we also have many recommendations that we know what to follow. And most of us know these and often will implement them in our own lives. But unfortunately, what we're seeing overall among children is that 4 to 8-year-olds, only 37% of them are eating the recommended number of vegetables or fruit per day. And only 18% of that population are eating the recommended vegetables per day. 9 to 14% of 2 to 5-year-olds are drinking 1 cup or more of sugared sweetened beverages. And as we know, that is a big culprit in terms of poor health, not just weight, but also dentition. And then also, this is the whopping number that I just picked up recently, 7 hours per day of screen time is what children and teens are doing that are not related to schoolwork, because you often get that kind of, oh, I'm on my screen for schoolwork, but that's for entertainment. So we all know that even though we have all these recommendations and people know them, we all know them, motivation's hard. And I want a fitness video, do you deliver? I mean, we've all been on that couch, and many of us have tried to nudge people off that couch. And so I was part of an Institute of Medicine committee in 2011 that published a report looking at what could we do for 0 to 5-year-olds to help move the needle, to help nudge people off the couch. And we looked and recommended that policies were an important area to address. And those would be policies related to the environment that the child is raised in, whether it's the child care setting, the preschool, or perhaps even media. We see that children are exposed on a regular basis, as we know, through the onslaught of unhealthy foods being advertised to them. And so these were the kinds of things that we recommended should be minimized. We also recommended that we focus on assessment. That would be for the providers. We really need to have people picking up early detection is a much easier way to reverse pediatric obesity than catching these children who are in a situation where they are morbidly obese, which means at the 99th percentile for body mass index. Also healthy eating, marketing, screen time, all of these were recommended. What I was really focused on from this particular set of recommendations was the parents who have a profound influence on the eating and physical activity habits of preschool-age children. And yet, at that time when we made this recommendation, there was very little, there were very few studies that talked about the how. And then also, we recognized in our report that parents play a key role. Again, though, how can they play a key role and be more effective? And routines were really considered to be a big part of what we recommended. And some of the emerging science that was coming out from national studies from data were the following. Preschool children, these were Latino children in childcare, were protected from obesity compared to those cared for by parents and relatives. And this was hypothesized as the reason being that, as we know, in a childcare setting, you're much more likely to have routines, right? Just as we heard from Dr. Mendel. Nap time is built in, and snack time, and so forth. And so that was a really important study that was published around the time that we came out with our recommendations from the Institute of Medicine. Also, another study that was across the United States found that there was a 40% decrease in obesity prevalence for children who were exposed to 3 basic household routines. And those were the following: regular eating the evening meal as a family, obtaining adequate nighttime sleep, and limited screen viewing time. At the same time as these this study and these recommendations for IOM were coming out, the American Academy of Pediatrics also culled the literature and came up with what was found to be the strongest evidence to prevent pediatric obesity and treat it. And these were the following: minimize sugar-sweetened beverages with the goal of 0. Increase meals prepared at home. Education and modification of portion sizes. Reduction of inactive time to less than 2 hours. In other words, less than 2 hours of screen time. So we're going to get the 7 hours average down to 2 hours. That's a big jump, but we've got to do it incrementally, and it has to be a goal for all of us. And then increasing active time to greater than 1 hour a day for children. And that doesn't have to be all at once. It could be at 10-minute intervals. And of course, the big question, how? When I was practicing for 20 years at Venice Family Clinic, this is what came up all the time. Yes, I know my child needs to eat fruits and vegetables, but how? How can I get them to do it? I know I can't have my child watch more than 2 hours of TV, but how do I stop them without having a big meltdown or tantrum? And so at the time that all these recommendations were coming out, which we started to point to routines as a big piece to this whole equation, I realized I could not teach parents in a clinical setting how to implement routines. I could convey information, but it was very difficult for me. And I talked to a parenting expert at UCLA who'd been working in this field for 30 years, and he said, Dr. Fred Frankel said to me, "You're right, Wendy, you can't do it in 10 minutes. And I think that's probably obvious for most of you, but I really was determined, and so what I did was I talked to him about, well, what can we do then? And so his science and his classes that he'd been developing for 30 years that showed how he could effectively confer skills for parents to be effective parents. We merged his science with the science I was familiar with for the last 30 years around food and physical activity and sleep and parenting, parents and counseling parents, and we merged that science. So this is what we call transdisciplinary solution building, and it's really something that we need to be doing in all fields, like planetary health as an example. And so what we did was we put these two sciences together, and we created 7 classes with 2 booster classes, and we validated it with a WIC dietitian, a mother, a pediatrician, a social worker, a psychologist, and we pilot tested it. And during our pilot test, we found that the routine class, which was just 1 class, we had to extend to 2 classes because that was where all of the effort that parents were trying to change in their lives, and that took more time than just 1 class for them to learn. How did they learn, though? The learning came from, so what we did before I tell you about the classes, I want to explain to you what we decided to do was test this in a randomized controlled trial. So what we did was we chose a group of parents that were willing to participate, and we randomized one group of parents with 2 to 5-year-olds to take the classes once a week for 7 weeks with 2 booster classes 1 month apart. And then we put another group into what we call the waitlist control, that we were then going to offer the classes to them at the 1-year outcome mark when we completed the study of the intervention group. And our question, or what we were examining, was the effects of this multi-component parent training program on the prevention of overweight and obesity among children ages 2 to 5. And what we wanted to do was reduce the upward trend that we had been seeing in our clinic and also in the data nationally, where children at 2 were about, in our clinic at least, there were about 20% of our 2-year-olds were overweight or obese, and by 4, those same children, 40% of them were. And so we really weren't doing a good job educating them on how to do implementing the knowledge that we conferred in the clinic. So we had to try this new method. And so this class was not just focused on weight, we were focused on parenting, and we also focused on different topics like increasing fruits and vegetables, reducing low nutrient foods, such as sugar sweetened beverages, increasing physical activity, and reducing sedentary activity, and also improving sleep was a big part as well. So the way we did it was through a social learning strategy. It was a 1.5-hour class, and what we did in the first 30 minutes was this homework review. So we gave parents homework to practice over the course of the week before, and they would come back and they would share their successes and they would share their challenges. As an example, one of our parents came to the class, and after they heard the successes of other parents, they said, well, you know, I didn't do so well getting my child up in time to have breakfast and get ready for preschool. My child wouldn't get out of bed. I could hardly put the shoes on the child before we just had to run to the preschool to make it on time, and we never got the breakfast in. And so the other parents who had been successful in instituting a routine where they could start breakfast said, well, why don't you try giving your child some food, the dinner a little earlier in the evening, and that would mean then giving the snack a little earlier in the day, and then instituting that bedtime routine that Dr. Mandel was suggesting children do really well with. And so she heard from the parents, her peers, who had real life experiences like her. She went home, she practiced it, she came back the next week with a big smile, and she said, oh my gosh, that worked so well. And so working on your routines, but also having your peers share their successes and what they think you could do is a really effective method in terms of adult learning overall, especially around parenting skill building. The next 30 minutes was spent in the class on skill learning. And so it included not just parenting, but also food subjects. So for instance, portion control was one of the, appropriate portions was an area that the American Academy of Pediatrics suggests as one of the most effective methods to prevent and treat pediatric obesity. But how do you do it? So we actually gave everyone a MyPlate, the size that you would have as a plate for a preschooler. And we went over the different portions of the fruits and the vegetables and the grain and the protein and described the fist of the child being the fruit, the vegetable, the grain, and the palm of the child being the amount of the protein that you would have on that plate. And so this was the kind of educational experience. It was interactive, it was hands-on, and then at the next 30 minutes we had the parents practice a new skill. Usually it was related more to the parenting aspect of the curriculum. So as an example, in order to give a child a command, we know that if you are walking out the door and screaming, telling them what to do, that doesn't work, right? Like, put your shoes in the closet, please, you know, that kind of thing. Whereas, and the worst is if you ask the question, can you put your shoes in, no questions. You say, it's called CCQ, close, calm, and quiet. Can you put your, no, not can you. Please put your shoes in the closet. One directive, you're down, your eye level, CCQ, close, calm, and quiet. Should try it with your husband sometime. So the parenting skills that we covered are praise, routines, commands, ignore, setting limits, timeouts. The essential strategy were routines. And what we did was we worked with the parents for 2 sessions. So this was, because we found in the pilot that this was critical. Scheduling in the activities for the day was critical. You almost have to be like a preschool teacher, right, to be a parent. Scheduling in nap time, TV time, family meal time and snacks, exercise and play time. And assigning times to these, like moving, but you have to move backwards. For instance, the mother I described, yes, she couldn't get her child up in time to have breakfast, and now I know from Dr. Panda she has to wait an hour, so that's going to be an interesting twist to it all. But anyway, you have to work backwards, and you have to say, okay, what time did my child go to bed the night before, and what time did we have dinner, and what time did we do the nap the day before. All of these we know can have a positive or a snowball effect in terms of having a positive routine or a routine that is disrupted. And the most common mistakes, getting up too late and putting the child to bed too late. It's just back to the basics, really. So I'm going to give you an example of family meals, and I know many people, when they think family meals, they think of a family all sitting around and with the father and the mother. I'm going to just say that family meal is just a bucket of a description of people sitting at a table with a role, especially for preschoolers, with a role model, older person at the table, whether it's an older sibling or a caregiver or a parent. And it doesn't necessarily even have to be at dinner time. So traditions, I'd like to say, are something you have to always consider when you're talking about mealtime. You need to want to explore with people what their traditions are, because they're passed down by generations, and you don't want to put down a tradition that's really important for a family. You also want to recognize rituals. That's the symbolic acts that give meaning to repeated behaviors and communications. Like, I think I reflect on my mealtime. We usually say some blessing for, or we say we're grateful for the food we eat. And we also have the tradition of having candlelight at dinner. I even do it when I'm alone. It's just one of these cues that I have about mealtime. And then family structure is really important. You know, some families have single parents, some people have multi-generational parents, family members, aunts, uncles, neighbors. You just have to explore all that in terms of promoting a kind of meal that would be a positive meal. And then you have to think about the child development. So in the final, because we're talking about preschoolers, is to remember that parent modeling or any adult modeling or older person modeling is critical in developing their healthy behaviors later on in life. And that's why it's important that you sit with your child or your students if you have the opportunity, or your child care, the children you take care of in child care. If you can sit with them while they're eating and you eat as well, and most importantly, not have any electronics on or near the area you're eating. In fact, I was told yesterday by Dr. Mendel, have them in the other room. So you've got to be very cognizant of distractions, because part of this family meal is to interact and have conversation and talk about not just the food you're eating, but maybe what you just learned before if you're in the classroom, what you learned before the meal started, or what you're about to have going on in the next session of the class or the next part of the evening. You can talk about what you're going to do with the family or the child, or it might be their snack time. Again, I think it should be considered, you need to understand it should be flexible, because a lot of parents don't come home in time for when the child really should have their dinner. So you need to be thinking about this in terms of routines. So after all this, the 7 weeks, once a week for 7 weeks plus 1 month apart booster sessions, we found that at 1 year, the children whose parents had received this parent training class with nutrition, physical activity, and sleep and other healthy habits integrated into it, that their weights were healthier than those children that did not get exposed to this through their parents. This was among children who had BMIs 50% or greater. And so this was really like, we were like, wow, this is like so exciting. We actually found something that is such a common sense thing, teaching parents to be effective at implementing what they know is the right thing they want their kids to do. And so the LA County Department of Public Health adopted this curriculum, and they started implementing in 2015 in all their service planning areas in 20 sites, community sites, this program, this educational program. And it's available for anyone to use. It has a training guide. It's on our website at UCLA, and also it's on the county website. And it's open source, anyone can use it. And if you need any guidance on the social learning aspect, I'm happy to work with you on that, because that's probably the hardest part for implementers to engage in a social learning activity, because most of what you do as the facilitator of the class is to facilitate and not be the teacher. So we focused on the parent and the child and the family household routines and some of the other pieces that would help them implement their routines, like the giving commands and giving praise and so forth. We also have to understand that the child and the family are not isolated from the big world, right? There are friends and family, there's community and neighborhood, and there's organizations and institutions. And all of these different circles influence the child and the family. And so if you have any interest in any of these other components, feel free to reach out to me after this talk. I'm happy to share with you other interventions that you might be able to engage with. But we don't have the time today to go over all of those, but I'm happy to share what I know afterwards. But I do think that all of us, we are the examples. We are, many of us in this room are teachers or childcare workers or pediatricians or parents or grandparents or aunts or uncles. So I'm going to challenge all of you to take a pledge, okay? I'd like you to implement one of these healthful routines one at a time. And the first pledge is to eat 2 homemade meals in one day. That doesn't mean it has to be at home, but I want you to have 2 homemade meals, okay? It could count as a snack too. Do not use your electronics while eating, okay? Try that. Eat 1 meal a day with someone else and actually talk to them. Plan grocery shopping and meal prep. Go to sleep at the same time every night, and no electronics 2 hours before bedtime. Be a role model and lead by doing. And as Dalai Lama said, with the realization of one's own potential and self-confidence in one's ability, one can build a better world. Support healthier environments, incorporate 1 healthful habit per month, and support social emotional health. And I'll end with a haiku that my son wrote when he was in 3rd grade, and he's now a 2nd-year med student. Fruit comes from flowers. Fruit is very good to eat. I like to eat fruit. Thank you so much.